Welcome to Automation of the Week. I'm Brian Hayes, and every Tuesday I'll walk you through step by step how to build out an automation in Salesforce or Marketing Cloud account engagement to improve your business. This week, I'm going to show you how to update a date field on a contact record when a particular type of task is completed. This has a lot of different use cases, but the one that we're going to focus on today is one that's great for account managers. So let's say, for example, that you run client reviews. Maybe once a year, you meet with your customers and you review their account and their status, and you make sure that they're getting all the value that they should be getting from your product or service. Well, if you have a practice like that, it's probably very useful for you to track when that last review was. So I'm going to show you how to create an automation that'll make the reporting much easier. Another way to take a look at this is you're probably familiar with the last activity field on the contact and the account object. Whenever you complete an activity, that last activity field gets updated automatically. The thing about that last activity field, though, is that it doesn't discriminate against one sort of activity and another. It's just whatever that last completed activity was is going to update that field. So if there's a call or something or a meeting, that will get updated. But in our case, we just want a date field that gets updated when there's a specific type of activity. So when we have that client review, that's when we want that date to be updated. Then if we have that date field, super easy to report on it. You can easily see who's had a client review and who hasn't to make sure that none of your clients are actually falling through the cracks. So what we're going to do here is create a custom date field called last client review, and that'll be on the contact record. And then whenever there's a task with the subject client review that's completed, we'll just copy over that completion date from the task into that contact record. Then with that field there, it's very easy to report on it. So let me show you how to do that. Step one, let's create the field. Click the setup gear in the upper right, go to Object Manager, and then pull up the contact object. Go to Fields and Relationships, and then click New, and we can create a new date field. Hit Next. Give this one a name. I'm going to call it Last Client Review. So we're really replicating that last activity functionality. We're just going to control exactly what sort of activity is going to update this field. Now you can choose which profiles have access to that field. I'm going to leave the default, and we can add that field to any of your page layouts. I'm going to add it to all of them, and then hit Save. With that field in place, now let's create the flow. Go ahead and bring up your flow builder. Under Flows, click New, and this is going to be a record-triggered flow that is triggered by a task record. So under Object, I'm going to search for Task, but you could do this with events as well if you wanted. And I'll have this run whenever a record is created or updated that meets specific conditions. And those conditions are the subject must equal client review. If you want to be a little bit more flexible here, you could change equals to contains, and then maybe it says client review dash, this or that. So I'm actually going to leave it as contains in this case, just to have it be a little bit more broad. And then the next condition is going to be its status. So we want status to equal completed. And I'm going to add one more condition, and that's that it has an activity due date. So I'll say activity due date is null, and then for the value, put in false. So what we're saying here is that the activity due date is not null, is not blank. Because if there's no date in that task, there's nothing to push to the contact record in our new field. And I want this to run only when a record is updated to meet these conditions. The idea being when it is marked as completed, that's when it should push to the contact and update that date field. Because we're updating a related record, we're not updating the task itself. We want to choose the second option here for actions and related records, and then click Done. Now hit the plus sign to add an element here. And what we're going to do is update a record. So what we want to do is update the related contact. With other sorts of records, you'd probably want to select Update Records Related to the Task, because that's what we're doing. We're updating the contact that's related to the task record that started our process. Tasks, though, are a little bit tricky because they've got a lookup field there, the who lookup, that can look up to a contact or to a lead. So it's not available if we select this option. So what we need to do is instead choose the fourth option, which is to specify conditions and identify records. The object that we want is the contact object, and we're going to know it's the contact object we want because its ID will be equal to the task record that started our process and the ID that is in the who field or the name field. So if I search for who, you can see here it says who ID. So whenever you relate a task record to a contact or a lead, you're putting the ID value in that who field, and it'll say name on the task record itself. This last part here is to select the fields we want to update on that contact record. In this case, it is the last client review date field. There it is. And the value we're going to put in there is the due date of the task. So go to your record, that's your global variable, and then select due date and hit done. This flow here will work most of the time, but there is a certain issue that we want to avoid. And I mentioned earlier that who field that relates that task to a contact could also relate it to a lead. So it's possible that we could have a couple other situations happening here. Either the task is related to a lead, or possibly that task isn't related to a contact or a lead. That field is blank. In that case, we're going to have a problem with this flow because it doesn't have any record to update. So we don't want it to run, and we certainly don't want it to fail. So the first thing we can do is protect against that issue of there not being a related contact or lead. That who field is blank. To do that, we can edit our start requirements here and add one more condition. That last condition is going to be for that who ID to not be null. So we say is null equals false. Just like we have on the activity date, if there's no activity date or there's no person related to the task, we don't want this to run. But that doesn't solve the issue if this task is related to a lead. So there's actually two ways for us to solve this problem. The first thing we could do is run a get. So we could take that ID, we could see if it exists as a contact, and if it doesn't, then we just end the flow gracefully. The other thing we can do is add a decision point, and we can actually look at the ID, and based on the first few letters of that, we can determine whether or not it's a lead or a contact. So this is true for all of the different objects in Salesforce. There's a prefix at the beginning of that ID that will tell you what kind of object it is. So if you search for Salesforce ID prefix, it'll lead you to this Salesforce help article where we can see all these different entities, all these different objects, and what the prefix is for them. So you can see here for job tracker, it's OJT. For setup custom node, it's OJX. And the example they have at the very beginning actually is for a contact. It's 003 is the prefix for contacts. We can confirm that in our own org. If you pull up a contact record and you look at the ID, you'll see right there in the URL, it starts with 003. And that's going to be true for any contact that's in your system. Pull up another one here. There it starts with 003. If we look at leads, we can see this pretty easily too. It starts with 00Q. Pull up another one here. There it is, 00Q. It's always helpful just to refer to the documentation here if you're working with IDs that you're not very familiar with, because it'll tell you what sort of object it is. So in our case, we only want to proceed if that ID starts with 003. So let's do that and add a decision. So add a decision here, and we'll say, is related record a contact? So for our new outcome, I'm going to put yes, comma, contact. Here's where we want to create the logic to confirm that it is in fact a contact. So under resources, go to that $ record, that global variable for task, then pull up the who ID, because that's going to have the ID of either a contact or a lead in it, and change the operator to starts with. And then for the value, we'll just put in 003, just like any contact record in our system. So we want it to start with 003. Then click done. And for the default outcome, we'll just add a little plus here and end it. So that's our decision point, just making sure it's a contact, and then we'll go through with the step to actually update the record. Click save. I'm going to call this task-update last client meeting. And now to debug this, we need to have a task in the system that fits our entry criteria. I'm going to come down to this contact in the system. Under activity, I'll create a new task, just going to call it client meeting, with a due date of today and status of completed. Now that that task exists within our system, we can come back to our flow, click debug, and select that task as the trigger. Client meeting, we'll run this in rollback mode, and let's say it was updated to be client meeting. Click run. So just running that out of the gate, it doesn't actually start because it didn't meet our condition requirements. So I'm going to hit debug again We'll choose client meeting, and this time I'll skip the condition requirements for starting and hit run. Okay, this ran without any errors. On the right-hand side, we can see what happened. The interview started. We skipped the start condition requirements. And then our first decision was seeing if it started with 003. And you can see that logic written out here. We can see the ID of that contact. It does start with 003. So it proceeded, and then we updated the record. Let's debug it again, but this time with a task related to a lead. I'm going to create a new task here, call it client meeting -lead with the due date for today as well, and a status of completed. I'm going to click debug again, and this time choose a different record to trigger this. It'll be our client meeting -lead. I'm still skipping the start conditions and hit run. Here you can see our decision worked perfectly. It went to the decision point and it went down to the default outcome because it was not related to a contact. We can take a look at that decision logic here in debug on the right-hand side, and you can see that it started with 00Q, which is not 003, so it ended. Go ahead and click activate, and let's test this in the system. I'll create a new task, again, called client meeting, put the due date for the 10th, mark that as completed, and that should update our related contact. So it looks like, if we look at our last client review field here, it did not update. So I must have missed something, and it occurs to me that I named this task client meeting, and it should have been named client review. If you go back to the flow, you'll see that part of our condition requirements is that the subject contains client review, not client meeting. Always have to watch out for those little details. So I'm going to try this again. This time I'll use the right triggering words. It'll be client review. I'll choose the 7th for the due date. Mark this as completed, and then that should work. Hit save. There you can see it popped in right there, March 7th. This is a good reminder that when you're creating any sort of trigger that's based off text that is entered by a user, you have to be highly confident that the right text is going to be entered. In this case, if they enter client meeting, that is not going to trigger automation. Only client review will trigger the automation. I think triggering flows off of text values like this is really useful because it avoids the need of having to create additional fields. But if you do run into an issue with there being misspellings or people entering the wrong keywords, you could always create a pick list or something along those lines that forces them to choose the specific value so you eliminate those issues. In our example today, I showed you how to do this for a client review that account management teams might want to use, but there's a lot of other use cases here where you might want to track the date of a specific type of activity on a contact or an opportunity record, and the process would be the same for those different use cases. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please hit like and click subscribe for more. Also, please consider taking one of our courses at academy.rotive.io. Thanks for watching.